through a mock interview, and I said, so what have you read lately? And he said, I don't like to read. And I said, this interview is now over. You're going to go home. You're going to tell your mother what you responded to me, and we're going to do this again tomorrow.
So in that conversation, we also want to be able to anticipate, the questions here, right? We're going to share some sample questions with you in a second. You want to sort of like prepare your answers and also kind of, sort of be ready to share. And so, this is all just part of like the preparation process, right? And then when you're preparing your answers, you don't want to like write them down verbatim because people don't speak the way that they actually write. Right? You don't want to be like a robot up there. You want to kind of get your main points down, like bullets, okay? And know kind of like, I always say to people, have an answer prepared, know why you're saying that, and then maybe have an example or two that kind of illustrates that, right? To kind of ground the principle and reality for the interviewers. This isn't about like memorizing answers. It's about having a framework, again, like a list of bullets to kind of bridge to, right? And oftentimes your interviewers may ask you kind of like vague or open ended questions. And that's to get you to share more information about yourself, right? And then you'll have a chance to explain that throughout the interview. So having like some of the more specific examples or details of this is really kind of helpful. And so what I'll do now, Michael, is you sort of kind of give us your perspective on this. I'm just going to go over here to the sort of sample interview questions that I think people want to probably consider when they're preparing for an interview. So, Michael, anything more to sort of add to this as you're sort of?
One of the things Chris and I were joking about before we came on the air here was the interesting thing that you can do in a virtual interview that you cannot do in an in-person interview is you probably could make notes to yourself of your highlights and tape them behind your computer so that you make sure that you kind of slip it in at some point so that the interviewer isn't seeing you looking down at the desk to be reading something, but you're still looking at the camera and you've got what you need either superimposed or on another screen. So you're able to do that as well too. So that's a trick that a student can do nowadays that they could never have done years ago in a one-on-one interview. So that's something I we thought was kind of funny, but it's a reality in terms of what can be done now in terms of what a student can get away with, so, and who's to know that you're going to do that? I'm looking at some of these questions, and I see the question, what's your favorite book? I always ask the question, what have you read lately? That was something. And I said, and sometimes I'd say to a kid, the kid said, well, I don't read a whole lot, and I'd say, well, do you read, do you go online? The world has changed so much. When I was interviewing, I hate to say this, 25 years ago, people were reading books more often than they read books now, sadly, but if you, follow something, you read the New York Times online every day, tell the interviewer that, okay? Let them know that you're paying attention to those kinds of things in terms of that aspect, in terms of being kind of sensitive to know what's going on in the world right now in terms of that. So I think in many ways, there's so many questions here, as you said, you can go right through all these, some of them are a little heavy as I'm looking at them here. And, so a lot of it depends in terms of, something, in terms, actually, this is the place probably to stick it in. Chris and I were talking before, what if an interviewer asks you a question that you're really not comfortable asking, Right. And I think that, that's an opportunity, to be very honest with the interviewer, to basically say, I'm not sure I'm really comfortable answering that question. And to be honest with you, I'd respect a student who would say that to me in terms of that answer. Or if it's a question you don't really have an answer for, you might say, well, let me think about it, and maybe I'll get back to you. And Chris, you suggested this earlier. And then when you write a thank you note to the admissions person or the alumni after the fact, you can say, oh, and by the way, I was thinking about that question you asked me. And now that I think about it, this is how I would respond to it, or this is what I'm thinking. There's lots of ways to be able to kind of regroup, recoup, however you have to do this in terms of the process.
It's funny, Michael, this reminds me of another story. I have a student right now who's preparing for, he's doing job applications for consulting firms, et cetera. And he actually got to like the formal interview stage, and it was a super day interview, meaning it's multiple people, and you go, well, right now in the age of COVID and Zoom, you go from breakout room to breakout room to breakout room, meeting with different people. And there was one, he had a technical interview. It didn't go well, but I said to him, like, it's okay, right? Because the guy helped you understand how it's done. And then what we did was we found a way to actually take that mistake, if you will, or that sort of misstep. And then in the follow-up, the student actually explained exactly how it would work within a brand new context that we knew that the interviewer would care about. So, again, to your point, it's okay to kind of like punt on some questions, if you will.
Yep.
It's a great way to kind of follow up, right? And I think
One of
that
my-
actually would make a strong impression on somebody.
One of my favorite stories, and I know I said this in one of our early sessions, but I remember doing practice interviews when I was at Poly Prep. And I had a student, and I said, we'll go through a mock interview. And I said, so what have you read lately? And he said to me, I don't like to read. And I said, this interview is now over. You're going to go home.
Oh my God.
You're going to go home. You're going to tell your mother what you responded to me in this question. And we're going to do this again tomorrow with a proper answer. Came back the next day. Boy, did he have a different answer in terms of how he responded. The mother called me up. The mother called me up and thanked me, for the fact that I did it that way. She said he learned a really valuable lesson. So yeah.
That's a great story. Sorry. So this slide right here, again, casestudio.com/college-interview-questions. / that'll get you to the sample interview questions that I was just showing you. And again, we'll send these out to you with our follow-up email. All right, so anticipating the questions, right? Prepare your own questions for the interviewer. Now, usually, Michael, this happens at the end of the interview, right? Interviewers typically ask like, oh, you have more questions for me about the school, or, how do you coach people on handling those opportunities?
Well, again, we used the example before. You could prepare the questions and have them sitting on a sheet of paper behind your computer to be ready to ask them if it's something was covered or not covered in that respect. But I think it's an opportunity to think about, it gives the interviewer insight into you in the type of question that you ask. In other words, if you ask a question that clearly, how's the food? That does not give much insight into who you are. But if you start saying, I've been looking at your study abroad programs, and it's fascinating that you have a program in Seville. I've always been excited about the idea of going over there and studying. I love art. I love the kind of, and I speak fluent Spanish. That there are things that you kind of tie into a question to kind of get a sense of, what the interviewer can tell you about it. Also understand, though, sometimes the interviewer may not know the answer. Okay, that's one of the things to remember, particularly with alumni that have been away from the school for 20 years, may very well not have an answer to a question that is so pointed that there's a good chance they don't know the answer. But a good interviewer will say, let me look into that and I'll get back to you on it, okay? Just like you can do the same thing in terms of how you're not really comfortable answering a question for them. So I think in terms of using it in terms of thoughtful questions about the school, but I think many times the thoughtful questions should be directed to the interviewer or the student interviewer's own experience.
Right.
Because there's a chance to kind of go in depth to get a sense of how they experienced the school, how they did different things. If you were, for example, if you were applying to Brown and talking to a Brown alumni interviewer, how did you use the open curriculum at Brown? How was it something that benefited you? Were there courses that you took using the pass-fail option, and what kinds of courses were they? Did you interact with the RISD cooperative program in terms of taking an art class? To show the thing that you kind of understand, but your questions are thoughtful in the way that it engages the interviewer as well, too.
Michael, that's interesting because it reminds me of something that we have been talking about really for weeks now, and this particular session is an extension of it, which is how do I demonstrate interest in a certain school during the age of COVID when I actually can't go and visit the school? And what you're referencing now is, it made me think about how some schools at universities have their own sort of like admissions. Like, for example, like the engineering school have their own admissions info session, right? I'll take that, one step further and just sort of share with our audience that, the questions that Michael is currently asking or posing, you could go to the departments at those universities and ask to talk with professors, talk with students. Oh, you're like a computer science engineering student. How did you use the open curriculum at Brown, right? Or, oh, you're a student at the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. Well, how did you use the one university concept to actually get a different exposure, different perspectives on your interest in business through like the arts and sciences school or like communication school, et cetera. So, whether it's an interviewer or you're just simply doing your research to prepare for the interview, again, universities love being asked questions, and it's up to you to be kind of proactive in trying to engage them as much as possible.